In this video, we want to use the graph to determine the domain and the range. Now you can already see that I have written in here in green that the domain is referring to our x values and the range is referring to our y values, but you of course wouldn't have that on a problem, probably on a test or homework or something. That's what you want to have memorized, is that your domain is always talking about the x values of the graph and the range is always talking about the y values of the graph or of the function. So for this particular example that we're looking at, as you can see over here on the right hand side, the graph just consists of 5 points. We just have these discrete values or points on the graph. And so we don't ask ourselves, what we normally ask ourselves is the domain is how far to the left to how far to the right, and the range is how far down to how far up. But that only works if we have some sort of curve drawn for us. In this case, we only have dots. So you want to think of your domain as what are your x values, and you want to think of your range as just what are your y values. So let's look at the domain first. And what I would do is if you have a problem like this, and you can draw either on the screen or in your notebook, draw it out and then sketch this, what you want to do is just kind of trace each of these points back to the x-axis, because our domain is talking about our x values. So you want to trace everything back to your x-axis so that you can see what the x value is associated with that point. And this is the same thing. You could do this with a curve that we have. You could compress everything onto the x-axis, and that would be a good way of visualizing what your domain is. But if you do this, you can see our x value for this first point, the leftmost point, is going to trace back to a -8. And so our domain is definitely going to include the point -8. The next point is already on the x-axis, so that's going to be an x value of -5. And see, the reason I say to trace it down to the x-axis is because then you run into the exact point. Our center point that I'm kind of tracing down right now runs into the origin, so that's an x value of 0. The fourth point from the left that I'm tracing down right now runs into the x-axis at x equals 2, so we have an x value of 2 there. And then the last point, or the rightmost point, tracks down to a 6. So we want to include an x value of 6. Now we're putting these braces around the number -8, -5, 0, 2, and 6 are the numbers, because that's referring to a set of points. We don't have some continuous interval, so we're not using the parentheses or the brackets that we would use for an interval if we had a curve. Instead, these are just particular discrete values, or x values. So it's just going to be those points in braces like that, because it's a set. So we're going to do the same thing with our y-axis, our y values, and we're looking for the range. Instead of tracking everything down to the x-axis, we want to track everything to the left or to the right onto our y-axis. So let me erase these points that I put on here so that we can kind of simplify the picture. And let me make these points blue again, because they originally were. That point actually wasn't there. Alright, so now we have the graph the way it was. So remember, range, normally you would say how far down to how far up because you're talking about your y values, but since these are just discrete points, we just want to track everything back to our y-axis. So this is already on the y-axis, the top one. This point right here tracks back to a y value of 4. This point here tracks back to the origin, so y value of 0. The fourth point from the top tracks back to the y-axis, value of -2, and the bottommost point tracks to the left to a point of -6. And so we're just going to write down the y values of all of these points in red. So our range is going to be, I'll just start from the bottom, -6, -2, 0, 4, and 8. And so again, we put braces around that because those are just particular values in a set. We don't have any sort of continuous interval. And so it's just going to be in braces. And that's our answer.